Okay, let's take a look at some of the filters that we're going to be playing with in After Effects. The thing I'm going to focus on in these lessons is the ability to start mixing effects together. A lot of people tend to think that demonstrations or examples of effects are just kind of one at a time and we work our way through the effects menu. What I'm going to do is show you some great ways to mix the effects together to produce all sorts of wonderful compositions. And you'll also notice a lot of the time that I'm going to be using adjustment layers to apply the effects to because it's easier to use and control, and I can also then apply effects to multiple layers at the same time. These will be some really fun lessons that we can work with, and you'll see how we go through them. So I'm going to start with our first composition. It's called Invert, and what we'll do is we'll just hit the 0 key and do a preview through our timeline. And you'll see I have a graphic that I've created that's moving, bouncing up and down, and pushes some text out the way, and then it jumps up, drops down, and then forms our T3V logo. So this is just sort of one of our intermediate advertising campaigns here for the station. That's great. What I want to do is kind of pretend that this thing is a little performing graphic, okay? We've got this almost like an animal here that's bouncing around. I want it to do its spin, and when it lands, I've got a whole bunch of people taking photographs of it, so I want all these flashbulb effects on it. For that, I'm going to use a filter called Invert, which not a lot of people will think could be used for this particular effect, but that's exactly what we're going to do. So I'm just making sure that I'm over here towards the end of my timeline, around about 5 seconds, just a bit before. And you can see down here in the timeline, I have an adjustment layer that's recognized by this icon over here, an adjustment layer called Effect. So at the moment, it's just a solid that has nothing applied to it. So I'm just going to highlight that. So I'm going to come up to my Effect menu, come down here to Channel, and choose Invert. And the first thing you'll notice is that everything gets inverted in a negative form. So all of a sudden, we've kind of lost all of the general color in our image. Everything's been reversed around this opposite way. So our 3 here has become blue, the sort of color negative of orange. And our image here has obviously been blown out in the background as well. So whilst this initially gives us the effect of flashbulb, it's not the exact effect that I want because I don't want to affect the color here. Now, just looking through the options I have, at the moment we are inverting the RGB channel, and obviously I can go through any one of these and choose different values. And don't forget, because we're applying this to an adjustment layer, it is applying to every single layer below this. Because of the stacking order in the timeline, the adjustment layer is on top of everything else and will affect everything beneath it. And there's obviously various things we can do here, so the hue angles and lightness, all these different things that we can do. The cool thing about this, though, is if I come down here and choose luminance, what this allows me to do is to apply a negative, but it only affects the very darkest pixels. So effectively what I'm doing is inverting the luminance, which is the brightness and contrast of the layer, but I'm not affecting the chroma, which is the color. And you can see that the top of the furry animal here is still in the brown color that we originally had, and the logo here is still in orange, okay? Best way to check it is to turn off the filter and bring it back on again, and you can see those highlights on the top. And this effect is giving us the flashbulb effect. It looks like we've got a camera that's just blowing itself on there and off again. Now I want to animate this so we get a few flashes in here. Now I'm not going to be able to do this within this palette. The only option I have here is blend with original. You can see that right there. And if I drag that, what it'll do is it'll blend through 50% where you don't actually see the image and come all the way back to the original. So I can't very well use this for the animation. Okay, so I'm not going to do that. I'm actually going to close this palette down. I'm going to come down here to the timeline, and I'm going to hit the T key to give me the opacity, because what we're going to simply do is just blend the layer itself between 0 and 100% without any interpolation, just difference between one keyframe and the next. So we are at the start of our layer at the moment. We're at 417, and I'm going to turn on a keyframe for opacity, so we're at 100% at this point. And what I'll do is I'll just extend my layer name window here so we can see the opacity value and the keyframes at the same time. Let's just come across there on the right. And all I'm going to do is use my page down and page up keys on the keyboard so I can go through just a few frames at a time and decide how long I want this flash to be. Okay, so starting where we were at 417, I'm just going to press the page down key 3 times. That'll give me 3 frames. And what I'm going to do is apply another keyframe just by clicking here. That will add another one at 100%. And we can see that over here on the right hand side. Now I'm just going to hit the page down key once, which will give me 1 frame difference. And all I'll do is drag this down now to 0%. Now, because we've done it 1 frame apart, you'll see as I hit the page up key once, it will go back a frame, and there's the effect. Down 1 will actually remove it. So what I could do is if I drag here and zoom up now on this particular part of the animation, I can see the keyframes that I have. So this is 100, 100 to 0, okay? So what I'll do is come across a little bit more, maybe another 2 or 3 frames, keep this value again at 0%. What I'm going to do is click again in my timeline to add another keyframe at 0%. And then what we'll do is just drag and select these 3 keyframes. And I'm going to copy them, Control C. And we'll just move along another frame, don't forget, because we're going from here 0 to 100, and paste. And those frames are now added in. So what we get is another flash. We now have 2 of them. That's just fine. And let's go across a little bit more, and we'll do the same again. But because we now have a 0 and a 100, see here at this point we're at 0, and this point we're at 0, what I can do is now select all 4 of those keyframes, copy those, and paste those in. So then at this end we have another flash. Okay, so what I'll do is just hit 0 to do a preview of this. Most of it's already rendered because we've only made changes towards the end of the timeline. And you can see that as the object lands on the page, we have this wonderful camera flashbulb effect, which is all done by inverting just the luminance channel. Don't forget that's the important thing here. So you can use this filter for many things, but this is just one of those great reasons for using it. It just keeps these highlight edges across the top here, still in focus in the original color, and gives us the effect that we are looking for. Okay, let's just click to stop this. What we're going to do is go on to the next effects composition now. So come up to the top of the comp window, close this one down, and then over in our project window, let's open the second one. This is Emboss and Find Edges. Now, if I just hit the space bar here to play this animation back, you can see that we have a sun graphic rotating around the outside, and we have a plane that appears just over the edge. And this is kind of an intro to a travel documentary that's going to appear on the TV station. And I personally want to spice this up a little bit. It's looking somewhat plain. It's using very straightforward vector graphics, although the color scheme is kind of okay. I do want to play around with some of our effects. And for this, I'm going to use Emboss. Now, Emboss as a default is something that most people recognize from Photoshop, and it does very much the same sort of thing. But we can obviously enhance that with a little bit more work. So I'm going to come back to the start of my timeline, and I'm going to hit Control Y or Command Y on the Mac. That will bring up my solid settings window. And all I'm going to do is just quickly name this one. Let's back that up and say Emboss. And I will make sure that it's the size of my composition. And let's say OK. Now I'm showing you 2 ways here to deal with adjustment layers. What I've done there is just created a solid. Some of the reasons I like to create solids first is the fact that I can then name it and then turn it into an adjustment layer. If I create an adjustment layer from scratch, I then have to go back and rename it. Whereas here it's a little bit easier for me to do because now in my timeline I have my emboss layer. I can just click here and turn that into an adjustment layer. It's up to you which way you want to approach that, but that's my personal preference right there. What we'll do now is just go up to my effects menu, come down here to stylize and apply emboss. And as we can see, there's not a lot going on here. That's because we need to adjust some of the settings. And the first one I can have a look at is just the relief value. And at the moment it's set to 1, which is giving us no result whatsoever. And as soon as I just click and drag on that, you'll see that I have a full-on emboss of my image here. And personally, I don't like that. Okay, so this is the whole reason I'm showing you this lesson, is because we're going to create a much nicer emboss, one that's also animated, because we're going to have it affected by the sun that moves around the planet here, and produce a much nicer looking graphic that includes color, not just this grayscale emboss. I wanted to introduce you to where that function was held inside the effects menu, okay, but we're going to back up a few steps here and try something different. So emboss is still selected in my effects controls palette here. Let me just hit the delete key and remove that. Let's close that window down. And what we'll do is come down to the timeline. I'm just going to hold down the space bar and just drag up here so we can see all our layers, okay? And I'm going to isolate just 2 of the layers that I wish to work on right now, which is the globe and the backdrop color, okay? So we're just left with the base 2 graphics that I want to actually play with, because this is where we're going to start all our effects from. Now we're also going to use the same adjustment layer that we just created. There's obviously a reason that we used it, so let's scroll up to the top again with the space bar and turn on that top layer as well, because our emboss function is going to be used in just a second. What I'll also do is hit Control U or Command U on the Mac and just turn on the anti-aliasing for that layer, okay, so it's all nice and smooth. And what we're going to do now is add a few effects to this adjustment layer to give us a really nice background we can use for our embossing effect. Let me first go up to the effects menu. I'm going to go down to adjust, and I'm going to choose hue and saturation, because all I want to do is now drain all of the color out of this background image. And quite simply, we'll just go to master saturation here and drain all of that out. Okay, so we're now kind of on a gray background. The globe has turned gray. What we're basically doing here is building a channel effect that's going to look much better when we emboss it. Rather than trying to emboss everything that's in color, let's build it from the ground up. That's my first effect. I'm happy with that. So let me close this up. So all we're left with is just that hue saturation. Again, I'm going to go back to my effect menu. I'm going to come down here and choose blur and sharpen and apply a very simple Gaussian blur. Again, that window comes up here in my effect controls palette, and if I just click and drag on the blurriness, I can choose how intense I want that to be. Now, the reason I'm softening the edge is because the emboss filter, as you saw, looks pretty rough when it's applied to a set of images that have hard edges. So this is going to give us a little bit more room to play with because we're creating a soft edge. And if I was doing this in Photoshop, I would do exactly the same thing. I would never choose to emboss something that has a hard edge. I'm going to use a soft edge for it. So if I just hold down my control key here, I can fine tune this. And let's go to 8.5. That will probably be just enough. I don't want to lose too much detail in there before I start to emboss it. Now I'm going to close that one up and I'm going to add another effect to this. So you can see again, like I said about these whole lessons, it's a good thing to play with and add multiple effects one to the other to achieve different looks. I'm going to go back to the effect menu, come all the way down here to stylize, and now apply some noise. Now, if you see in the palette here, it does give me an amount of noise, a noise type, and what happens when the noise gets clipped. I'm not really going to worry about the clipping option. I'm more concerned about the amount of noise and certainly its type. If I click and drag, you can see the noise is being created over the background. This is a great way to get video interference onto a clip if you want it. But what it's doing is it's creating color noise. You see here that the pixels on your screen will show up as kind of yellows and pinks and purples. That's because it's generating color noise even though we have a grayscale layer. So what I'll do is I'll turn off color noise, which now gives us just grayscale, and you see that's added a lot more effect to it. Now that's a little bit too much noise. I don't want as much as that. I'm going to bring this down to about 20%. That's pretty good. I don't think I need any more than that. But there's something very important to point out here. If I just close this, maybe even just move the palette out of the way. If I do a preview at this point, you'll notice that the noise effect is an animated effect. This is not what I want. Okay, there's our preview. Like I said, if you're trying to apply sort of white noise over the top of an image, the noise filter does that for you perfectly. You get this wonderful random pattern. But I don't want that. The reason I'm applying the emboss filter all the way throughout the end of this project is to create a background that's smoothly embossed but using just a static noise. I don't want this moving noise. So how do we get around that? If we look in the effects palette, there is no option to turn off the speed of the noise. It's just an amount. Okay, the amount is still animated on a frame by frame basis. So what we can do is use a little technique to actually save a copy of this image out as a flattened version to our hard drive, which we can then pull back in as a graphic. What I'll do is come up to my composition menu. I'm going to come down and say save frame as, and I'm going to choose just to save it as a file. I don't want to save it as Photoshop layers. I just want to save it as a flattened file. And then all I need to do is choose exactly where I'm going to save it. And I will save it to my desktop just for now. That's really, really easy for me to do. And I'm going to call it emboss. Okay, I know the name of the file that I want it to be. And when I hit save, it will actually bring up the render queue. Now, the reason it's doing that is it's still allowing me to customize how I want to save this file. So I'll obviously make sure I'm using my best settings, so all my anti-aliasing is turned on. I make sure I have full resolution and everything. We're going to save a Photoshop 32-bit file. That means it will have an alpha channel in it if necessary. Well, our image doesn't have an alpha channel because we have a background layer that we're also covering with our effects. So there's no real need to worry about that. And obviously it's naming it as emboss PSD because we just specified that. So all I need to do is go ahead and hit render, and that will very quickly save that file to my hard drive. So let me just delete that, and we'll close the render queue down. So if I come back over to the project window, and I'm just going to right click and go to import file, and what we'll do is from our desktop, let's go all the way back to our desktop and locate my file here, which is our emboss PSD. Let me just open that. And at the moment it is saying it was rendered with an alpha channel. Don't forget we did choose it, and obviously around the edge of the image here where there was some feathering, we will get a slight alpha channel. I'm going to go ahead and say ignore. I don't really need that information, and say OK. And that's now here in my project window. What I'll do is just drag it down into my timeline on top of everything else, put it down here at the top of the composition window. And what I'll do is I'll select the emboss layer because that's the one we use for all our construction. That can now go. I'm just going to hit delete to remove that. And then I'll just solo the top layer itself because that's the only one I want to work with at this point. Now we're going to add a couple of effects to this one because we have the grounds on which we wish to emboss. So we've now got our noise, we've got our soft edges. Again, let's just hit Control U or Command U on the Mac to turn on the anti-aliasing so everything's smooth. And then let's go back up to our effects menu, come all the way back down to stylize, and once again choose emboss. But you'll see this time we have a slightly different effect. It's much more controlled. It's much smoother. It almost looks like grainy paper. It's exactly the effect I wanted to achieve. We've got this wonderful ripple in the background. and a nice soft edge to our object over here. Now we can still adjust a few of the settings. We have relief and contrast. So the relief I'm actually going to push up a bit more. Because we have grayscale in this image now, we have a much broader range of effects we can apply with regards to relief. So remember when we did this originally, it was much tighter. We just kind of went from 1 to 1.2 or something and everything went out of control. Here we have a much finer amount. So you can see I can even go up to 3 and we've still got this lovely effect. I'm going to bring it down to round about 2 to 2.2. That's just exactly where I need it to be. But then the contrast, I can push that up and get a little bit more strength in there. So I'm going to go for about 150. I don't want to go out too much. So this gives us our wonderful effect. Now what we can do is animate this. Now remember me mentioning that we have on the original graphics this sun that moves all the way around the outside, and I want the planet to reflect that. I want the side of the planet to be lit up and then shaded on the other side as the object moves around it. All we need to do is animate the direction, which is here, and you see if I click and drag around, we can do exactly that. So we have this really cool emboss effect. I'm going to start from the top at 0 degrees because I know that's where the sun starts. But we need to also find out where the keyframes are for the sun layer, because I know it doesn't start at 0 and it doesn't end at 4, which is the full size of our composition. So if we come down to the timeline, here is our sun star layer. We don't need to make it visible or anything. All I'm going to do is select it, hit the U key to show any of its keyframes, and we can see here that it actually rotates from 0 seconds all the way across to 3, but also importantly has an ease in keyframe here, so the motion actually slows down as it reaches this point. We obviously want our effect for the emboss to match the same process. So we know it's 3 seconds and we know it's set to an ease in. So let's just drag ourselves down the timeline so we can see our top layer, the emboss layer. This is our one we're working with. And what we'll do in the effect controls window, let's pull this down. We can see everything at the same time. We're at 0 seconds in the timeline, and I'm going to turn on a keyframe here for direction, starting at the top. And then if we just scroll through the timeline to 3 seconds, and I always tend to hold down the shift key at this point because if I have a keyframe on the timeline already, it will snap my cursor into that place so I know exactly where my effect is going to end. And then all we need to do is now drag the angle around a full 360-degree turn, okay, or just 1 revolution. And then in the timeline, let's hit the U key for this layer so we can see the keyframes we just created. And I'm going to right-click or control-click on the Mac, bring up my keyframe assistant on this final keyframe and say easy ease in. So that will slow the motion down, exactly the same keyframe as we have with the sun. So quick RAM preview at this point, you can see the effect is moving around, the emboss is animated, and it does slow down very nicely as it reaches 3 seconds. Now, I also want to color this background because don't forget, we're still using a gray, which is kind of a leftover feature of when you use the emboss filter. So I'm just going to hit F3 to pull my effects window back to the front. I'm going to go back up to my effects menu, go down to adjust, and again apply hue saturation because what I can do now is colorize this. So let's just collapse our window here. It's a bit easier to see. There we go. And down here we have our colorize option. So now I can apply just a general color to the background and make it look like the sort of parchment paper background I'd like it to be. So the first thing I need to do is affect the saturation amount. So I can just push up the color, not too much, around about 30 or 40 is pretty good. But then most importantly, the colorize hue angle itself, because this is where we rotate through the hue angles and we can choose which color value we wish to apply. And I'm going to go for kind of a sandy brown color. So something around there will suit me just fine. Okay, let me close this window down. All we need to do now are reorganize the layers so we have everything in the right order. So let's come back down to the timeline. Let's just collapse that one. All our effects are applied. Let's come right back to the start as well, just so we know where we are. And I'm going to turn off the solo option here. Okay. Come back, scroll up the window using our spacebar and turn off these bottom ones as well. Now we're still left with our effect right at the top. So all I'm going to do is just drag that whole layer all the way down here, but make sure it sits above those 2 background layers because we don't effectively need those anymore. What we're left with are just the graphics we want to see. So if you wanted to possibly save on a slight bit of rendering time, just turn those 2 off. They're not actually required. So let's go to the main composition window now and preview it. Just hit the 0 key and you'll see a really nice effect. We've got our sun moving around the outside. The star background we have here is really nicely embossed because it's sitting on top of another layer, the one that we created with all our effects. And you can see a marked difference between what we thought we had originally just by applying the default emboss filter. See what you can do when you start applying a few things together, save a file out, bring it back in and just soften everything up and add some color to it. You can get some really nice effects. And then the fact that we did link together the rotation angle of our emboss with the sun at the same time is a really nice feature. Okay, what I want to do now is add a little bit more effect to this composition. We've got a really nice logo backdrop. We've done the emboss. I want to have some animation moving across the background. I'm actually going to use an image of some elephants. I want kind of a safari feel to this. But I want it carefully done, almost like a cell animation that's got very highlighted edges moving across the background. We're going to use a filter for that called Find Edges. But before we do that, let's bring in the footage that we need. So let's come across here to the project window. And in our emboss source folder, we'll drop that down. You'll see we have a movie in here called Elephants. And what I'll do is I'll just double click to open that so you can see it. Okay, there we go. Let's hit our play button. And we can see that's exactly what it is, just a herd of elephants moving across the plains. Now we'll just drag this down onto the top of our timeline. So let's just make sure we're scrolled all the way at the top here. And that'll appear right there. Now it's going to come in rather small. And obviously what I could do is drag the corner points to scale it up. I'd rather use my really cool shortcut, which is Control-Alt-F or Command-Option-F on the Mac. And that will scale my image up to immediately fit the size of my composition. Nice fast shortcut. Obviously at the same time we should turn on anti-aliasing here so everything's nice and sharp. And then what we'll do is come up to our Effects menu. Let's come down to Stylize and let's choose Find Edges. Now you can see immediately this has given us a pretty cool effect. It's actually found all of the darker, more contrasty edges of our image and turned everything else to kind of a white or even sections of grey. Where this grass is, it looks really nice. We could obviously invert that. There's only a few simple options inside this palette. Okay, so we can invert around. And like we did earlier on, you can also say blend with the original. And as you do, it kind of crosses between the two. But instead of giving this sort of nasty grey midpoint where you lose all the image contrast, here you can actually do a really nice mix where you still see some of the live action, but you also have the Find Edges filter on top. So if I go for around about 60% and just do a round preview of that, it's a really nice effect. Okay, so it's giving it that kind of cell-like animation, a little bit more contrasty, almost like it's been posterized or treated maybe in Illustrator to give it vector outline. So this is quite a nice little effect. Now, I'm just going to push this down a little bit more because I do want some more contrast in here. Let's bring it down to about 50%. And then we can decide how we want it to interact with our background. Now, there's no other options in here that will allow me to do that. This is going to come down to our layer blending mode. So let's go ahead and close that palette down. Let's come back down to the timeline and activate our switches and modes so we can see our layer blending modes. And obviously at the moment we are set to normal. We can see that here. Now, rather than going through each of these and just trying to choose one and see what's going on, I can use my shortcut for this, which is just to hold down the Shift key and then use the plus or minus keys. So if I hit the plus, you'll see it starts rotating me through the color blending mode. So I'm now on darken, and you can see how it's interacting with the background. And I can choose any one of these. That one's actually really nice. That's color burn. Very, very strong background color. It's giving us almost an additional emboss. You can see how it's affecting the grass down here and making that much stronger. I'm going to come through just a few more. We have add, lighten is pretty good. I'm actually going to come down here and choose overlay. Okay, that's giving me just the right amount of contrast in my background. But at the moment, the layer is a little too heavy, and obviously it's in the wrong stacking order. It is sitting on top of absolutely everything. So let's grab this and just move it down, and I'm going to bring it all the way down here and place it just above the embossed background. So that brings all our graphics to the front. And then what I'll do is hit the T key to give me the opacity for this layer. And then I can choose to fade that down to whatever strength I want it to be. Okay, so I probably don't want to go any less than about 70%, but that's still going to give me the background effect I need. So let's come back to the comp window and do a 0 key RAM preview. And now we can see everything together. We've got a herd of elephants moving across the background in a very cell animation style. We've got our plain graphics set as it originally was. We have our sun moving around the planet with our embossing. And this produces a really nice graphic. So this is all kind of for a travel program. Funny thing is, this little town here, Braffing, United Kingdom, is where I used to live. And we certainly didn't have herds of elephants running through the center of the town. But it's a nice touch anyway. So you can see here that the emboss filter and the find edges filter, once you start mixing them together, you can get some wonderful, wonderful effects. So go ahead and play with them, create some really cool things. Now, something you do need to be aware of, you can see here on the outside of the animation, you can see an outer edge that's being embossed and is also rotating its highlight value based on the central one here. And that's because our emboss effect is applied to the whole layer and will pick up any edge that is also visible, basically the alpha channel. And obviously this layer ends outside of here. You need to bear that in mind. So the way to get around it would just be to gently scale the background so it's kind of slightly off the composition, or even apply a mask around the edge with just a feather so the end kind of blends out into the background. So there's a couple of ways you can hide that. I just wanted you to be aware of that when you make out your composition. Okay, let's go ahead and stop that preview and let's close that project down. And then back into the project window, let's just tidy up our list here. And we're going to come in and open composition number 3, which is mosaic, and double click that. And you'll see what we've got is a kind of a binoculars type view here. It's almost like one of those nighttime vision goggles. And we're going to use an effect called mosaic to kind of deal with the zoom levels that we're going to increase on the mountain shot here. Now, if I just scroll the timeline through, you'll see that the central graphics in the middle of our lenses are slightly flickering. Then there's a screen kind of redraw. There's a flash comes down the screen and we have a zoom on our image in the background. And as we go on, we have another zoom and then it continues pretty much the same way, okay? Now, the thing about this is I'm not using one image for each of these zooms. These are actually some images I took last year in Yosemite of Half Dome. And I took them from various distances, not for this particular project. I didn't plan this far in advance. But it's worked out really well that these give me exactly the right amount of zoom that I need. So I'm actually chopping and changing each file as I go along and showing a different one after each preview. We come down here to the timeline and just hold down the space bar and scroll up. There we can see these are my images, okay? These 4 layers here. As I scroll through, you can see each one of those is a brand new image in that place, okay? So this is what we're going to play with. And what I want to do is every time the screen kind of closes and opens up like this, I want the image to be very pixelated as if it's having to calculate the new zoom and then fade out. And this is going to end up being yet another sort of title introduction sequence to our T3V. It's just one of those funny little intros that we're creating for the project. So what we'll do is we'll come back to round about 2 seconds because we're going to put our first mosaic right here, okay? This is where the shutter closes for the first time, and as it then opens, we're going to see our first image, and that's where we need to do our effects. Now, if I scroll back up the timeline, I have a solid layer here called mosaic. We can see that over here. And if I change back from my modes back to my switches, you can see that mosaic is in fact an adjustment layer, okay? Because any of the effects we apply to this, I want to apply to all the layers beneath it. And then below that, you can see the one that's called green FX. That's what's turning every image into the background into that nice green look. So if I just scroll a little bit further out, I'll come down and turn the green effects off. You can see the full color image that was there. So this is just an adjustment layer with hue saturation applied to it, which changes the background, okay? So mosaic is the one we're going to deal with. So let's come back to the very start there at 2 seconds. I'm going to select my mosaic layer and then come up to my effects menu, come down here to stylize and go straight down to mosaic. Now we won't see the effect take place immediately because our shutter is still in its way, okay? So if we just move the timeline along a little bit more, now we're revealing what's going on underneath here and we can see the mosaic pattern. Now the way that the palette works is very, very straightforward. We only have a couple of options. First one says horizontal blocks and the second one is vertical blocks. This is the number of pixel sections it's going to create for us, and this is where we create the amount of detail that we need. So if I do click and drag on the horizontal one, you see I'm able to get finer detail and the same on vertical, okay? So we have the ability to achieve the same amounts, do whatever I need to. I can also choose sharp colors, which kind of hardens up the contrast and gives me less smooth pixels by bringing up the levels here, almost making it a little bit more chunky as if it's finding it harder to resolve the resolution. So I'm going to turn that off. I'm quite happy at being soft colors. I've got no problem with that. Now, I'm going to set this originally to about 60, okay? Because we're going to set this in 3 different levels. There's 3 shutter clicks, and the first one wants to be 60, and it's going to fade to 0. Then as we get closer to the object, we'll go 40, and then closer again, we'll go 20. So the resolution will get a bit more chunkier as we go through the animation. So I'm going to make sure that in the timeline, we're back at 2 seconds, because that's where the effect first takes place. And what I'll do is apply now a keyframe for both of these items at 2 seconds. And then what I'm going to do is hit the O key, the letter O, which will take me to the out point of the mosaic layer. You can see my time cursor's jumped. That's at 3 seconds. So this whole mosaic effect is just going to apply over 1 second in time. And then in the effect controls palette, we can increase the value of this to make it a lot sharper. Now, obviously, it's going to find an endpoint where the layer cuts off, so we don't want to make it not fine enough. If we had it around about 100 or something like that, when this layer cuts itself off, you'll notice quite a difference between where these pixels end. And if I hit page down and go 1 frame, you'll see there's quite a big jump there between the finished quality and the sharp layer. So back to that final point at 3 seconds, I'm going to go even higher. Let's go up to about maybe 230. And then there'll be a much more subtle change from one to the other. Again, just hit page down and page up. There we go. That's much, much smoother. So if I just hit the 0 key at this point, let's do a very quick RAM preview of those first 2 or 3 seconds. And there we have it, okay? So we see there's the image, the shutter comes down, and we have our nice mosaic effect just bringing the new image into focus, giving us exactly what we want. What we can do now is actually duplicate this layer to help us achieve the rest of the animation in a very quick and easy fashion. So let's come down to the timeline and let's just scroll through to where the second shutter comes down, and that's right there. Okay, that's at 322. And I've still got this mosaic layer selected. What I'm going to do is hit Control D or Command D on the Mac and duplicate it so we have a second one. And I'm just going to drag it so it appears at that start point. Okay, so now if we just scroll through here, we have the exact same layer achieving exactly the same result. What we can do now is affect that. So that layer is highlighted. I'm just going to hit F3 to bring up its effect controls. And you see here now, I do have the second set. This is the first layer on the left. This is my new one. And we need to affect the keyframe value at the start of the layer. So shortcut-wise, just hit the I key. That will take me to the in point of this second layer. And you see here the value is 60. That's where we started. We're going to make it slightly more chunky now. I'm going to change that. I'm going to key in 40. Let's hit the tab key and do 40 again. So we're keeping the values the same. And then let's just scroll through the timeline. We can see the effect is now even heavier. Okay, we've gone slightly thicker. And it's still coming down to that same 230 value at that point, so it's nice and smooth. Now what we can do is apply the final one. So let's come back down to the timeline and once again just scroll through to where we reach that final shutter angle right there. Okay, let's come back a section. So we're at 522. And again, this second layer is highlighted. I'm just going to duplicate that again, Command D or Control D. Drag it out so it starts in the same place. Again, hit F3 to bring up that layer's effect controls right here. So now we have all three of them on screen. And we can see this one starts at 40. If you do want to double check, just hit the I key and make sure you are at the in point of that layer. Okay, if you see 40, you should be in the right place. But always just double check that. And then what we'll do is just very quickly change those. I'm going to bring them down really quite coarse. Let's go for about 15. Okay, so 15 on both of those. Let's continue scrolling through and we can see now a real chunky preview happening there and it fades out. We've actually got our little T3V graphic over here. What we'll do is we've now finished all of the mosaics, so I'm going to go ahead and do a preview. Let's close this window down. Let's hit the 0 key. So there's our first one, fades out nicely. Here's our slightly more coarse one. And then finally the big chunk one. And then Doug actually jumps up and appears in front of the camera. So let's do our playback on there. There we go, there's our first one. Looks really cool. Second, third, super chunky. And then we have this wonderful effect of him jumping down in front of the camera. So this is a really nice little title sequence that's been created very simply just using mosaic. But once you start animating those effects, you do get some interesting results, which in this particular arena, these kind of zooms up on images and bringing them back into full contrast is a really, really cool way of doing it. Now, one other thing I do want to point out in here is I've actually used a wipe to do our shutter transition. Now, if I scroll back through here, let's come back towards the first transition around 2 seconds. This layer that's appearing up and down here is not a solid layer that's being animated up and down. It actually has a transition applied, and I'm just going to show you how easy that is to work with. If I come down here to the timeline, you'll see that layer 4 here is my wipe layer. This is the one that's doing the work for us, and I have locked it just to keep it safe during the work we've been doing. I'm just going to hit to unlock it and select it, and if I hit the E key, you'll see it does have the linear wipe effect applied to it. But more importantly, across the right here, we can see keyframes, and you can see that as I drag through them, you'll see the keyframes basically start at the top, come down, and back up again. And each one's just basically a simple blink. Now that's just being applied to the transition completion value inside the palette. So let's come back to the start, and again just hit the F3 key, and that will activate the effect controls for the layer that we've got. And you see here that the linear wipe has been applied. Now just so you know where it comes from, if we go to the Effect menu and go all the way down to Transition, we have linear wipe right here. Now I'm going to go through some of these in just a second, but because this one is part of this project, I just wanted to point it out to you. And you'll see here that my transition completion value is what is being animated. It's got a stopwatch on it. The moment is 57%, and as we scroll through this, you'll see that it's showing up different values from 0 to 100. So it actually starts at 100 there. At the bottom of its point, it reaches 0, just another frame or so, and then out at the end, it comes back up to 100. So the keyframes have been added there. But a couple of cool other things you can do. If I go about halfway through the animation, you can change the angle with which the linear wipe is applying. So if you don't want it to come from top to bottom, you can always rotate it around and say, let's go bottom to top. It won't change any of the values that I have. It will just choose the start and finish angles. So if I drag this around here, you see we could start from this corner. So if I just scroll through the timeline now, you'll see the effect is coming from the bottom left and up to the top right and back again. But then you can also increase the feather value, and that's pretty cool because you can use it as a nice soft transition between layers. Now you could use this on a layer that's being used as a luma matte, so you could use it as a track matte. Let's just go through there and you see it's much more different. Almost looks like there's something passing in front of the camera now, almost as if it's not part of our scene. So just wanted to point out those couple of things for you. They're pretty easy to work with, but the linear wipe does have many functions. I thought it was a great choice to use for our shutter in this particular animation. So just wanted to show you that whilst we were right there. Okay, let's go ahead and close that composition down because we're going to focus on our next one now, which is over here, number 4, radial and block. Now these are both transition effects, but again, we're going to use them for some really cool animations. Now, if I just drag through the timeline here, we can see that I have a graphic of our T3V logo moving towards the center. This is kind of a sting where we're advertising that the T3V is going global and we want it to apply over to Europe. So I go through there and then I have a graphic appearing at this end, which is going to finish it off. Now, so there's a few things I want to do. There's 2 transition effects I'm going to show you. One is called block dissolve and the other is radial wipe. Now, radial wipe in itself is a very straightforward filter, but what I'm going to do is spice it up a little bit and use it to create kind of a radar effect in here to reveal this logo as it's moving towards the central graphic point here, okay? So making sure I'm back at the very start of my animation, what I'm going to do is come down to the timeline, and here I have a solid layer that's been created already called radial wipe 1. I'm just going to turn on its visibility so we can see it, and you'll see it's a very bright green layer. That's the color I want it to be because the whole radar thing is green. But we're going to apply our radial wipe effect to it. So go up to the effects menu, come down here to transition, and go straight down and choose radial wipe. Now when I do, we'll see that everything is completely green still because the effect is kind of at 100%. The reason this filter is set like it is right now is normally you use this to reveal through a layer. So when its transition value is set to 0, it means that it's solid, and you apply animation to that to then reveal what's going on underneath. And you can see just by dragging the transition completion value around, that's exactly what I get. So this is good if you were going to reveal through one layer to another. We're going to change this by making these actual parts of an animation rather than using it to reveal. But another one of these we are going to use as a mask for this layer right here. I don't want this visible all the time, so I'm going to actually do 2 radial wipes. Now what we'll do is set this one up initially. Let's bring the transition completion value down to about 85%, so I want it only about this wide. And likewise with the linear wipe, we also have the start angle, okay, which I can drag around, and that's what we're going to animate to make this move around in a circle, like so. Okay, let's just bring that back. I'll hit Command Z, Control Z to undo that. We can obviously adjust the wipe center. I do want to leave that exactly where it is, but that's here in the center of my graphic. If I wish to move that to another location, I can do just that. Again, just undo that. If you want to, hit F3 just to bring your effect controls window back. Then you also have control over the type of wipe. At the moment, it is defaulting to a clockwise. We can obviously go counterclockwise, or we can use both, which is quite interesting. So now when I drag through my transition completion, you'll see that it's working on both sides of the line. So it's almost like a butterfly wipe, okay? You can almost use this for a wing type effect. So don't forget, you don't have to use these just for transitions. They can be used on top of graphics as well. So let me undo that. I'm going to reset this back to clockwise. Okay, we're still at 85. And then down the bottom here, we have the feather value. And this is obviously going to soften that edge up to whatever we need it to be. So I'm going to take this up to about 30. I want a pretty soft edge on that. And then all we need to do is apply an animation. So this thing is now moving around the outside over the whole course of the animation. So what I'm going to do, we're at the start of the timeline. Make sure you're at 0 seconds here. I'm going to turn on the start angle. Okay, let's apply a keyframe at that point. And then I'm going to go all the way through my timeline. Just scroll through your timeline till you reach 6 seconds, the very, very end. And what we'll do is we'll animate this. Let's just drag it round. Let's go 1, 2, 3, maybe 4 rotations. Okay, and if I just hit the 0 key now and do a quick preview, you see we have this real nice radar effect moving around the outside. So we're not using a radial wipe effectively to reveal anything at this point. We're just using it for graphic purposes. Okay, and it's looking just great, exactly what I want it to be. Now, at the moment, the strength of this green layer is somewhat too strong, okay, because if it does go over the graphic here, you see we can't even see the graphic. So I'm going to come down to the timeline and just hit the T key to activate the opacity for this layer. And if we just scroll the window around so we can actually see the effect, there we go. And I'm going to drop this down to around about 50%. So this is going to be the starting point of the radial wipe. So we can now see through it to the logo. You can see that, but it isn't masking it at this point. We've got another couple of steps we need to do with duplicate layers. So I'm happy with that. This is going to be the leading point of the wipe. If you've ever seen something like this on a radar screen in the movies, they'll have a very strong signal that moves in one direction, and then behind it is almost like a feathered trail that still reveals this logo once the main pass has gone through it. That's what we're going to do just through some very simple other layers. So just going to come back to the start. We can close this window down. What I'll do is come down to the timeline again. Let's close that down. And I'm just going to select that layer and hit Control D or Command D on the Mac to duplicate it. So I'm creating a second one. And if I wanted to, I could go into the solid controls and change the name of that, but I know exactly what it is. I'm going to put this one behind the other one. Okay, this is going to be my second one, and I do want it to appear behind this one. And whilst that's selected, let's go ahead and hit F3 to activate its layer effect controls. Okay, so this is now for the layer that we're working on beneath this one. And what we can do is we're keeping the same animation. We don't need to change that, but the transition completion angle, we can now drag that in either direction to increase the amount of area that it covers. Okay, we could pull it this way so you get more of a hard edge at the front of the radar sweep. What we can do is pull it back now because this is going to be the bit that lags behind to reveal what's going on. So here I'm setting it to about 70%. That'll do. The same animation is still in force, so let's just hit the 0 key. Now we have two of them moving around, but they start in exactly the same place because the completion angle is what is making it extend out towards the back. Okay, so it's looking pretty good. Again, the opacity of this layer is somewhat too strong. So let's come down to the timeline. Let's hit the T key for transparency, select that opacity value, and I'm going to push that down to about 30%. Now we can see through it a little bit easier. Now, whilst we're down here, we're going to do one more duplicate because this is the one that's going to become the mask for the T3V logo itself. All right, so let's close that up. This bottom one is selected. I do want to duplicate this one because we have made changes such as opacity and the transition completion angle, so don't select the top one by mistake. And again, just press Control D or Command D on the Mac and duplicate it. And again, I'll place this one behind. Now, it's up to you which order you want to put these in, but I'm just making it more straightforward here because the top one is the strongest. The second one is the slightly reduced opacity one and the longer angle. This one here is going to be the mask. Okay, this is the one that's going to affect our logo, which is directly beneath it. Now, when we turn it into a mask, the opacity of the layer itself is very important. Okay, if we just hit the T key again, we know that this layer itself has been set to 30% because it was duplicated from the one above. If I turn this into a mask, we will only see 30% of the object that it's masking, because if the mask itself is semi-opaque, then so will the effect. All right, so what I'm going to do is push this back up to 100%. Obviously, everything will all go very sharp and contrast. We can't see anything right now, but we are going to turn this into a mask, so I'm not worried about that. What we need to do now is tell this logo right here, the T3V logo, to be masked out using the layer above. So let's come down and choose switches and modes, and that will activate our track map functions right here. And what I will do is come to the option for this layer itself, and I'm going to apply a luma matte. That's going to take the luminosity values from the layer above it and turn it into an opacity mask for it. So the mask has been applied. If I now go through the animation, you can see that I can't see the logo once that outer wipe has passed through it, and that's exactly the effect I'm looking for. So let me just hit the 0 key, do a RAM preview, and we can see the radar moving around the outside as it reaches there. There's our graphic. It still appears in the second part of the wipe and then fades out nicely behind. So we've used 2 wipes. In fact, we've used 3 wipes to achieve this effect. Let me just rotate that around a couple of times and hit the 0 key again. Let's just preview that in real time. So we get this lovely radar effect of our logo moving from the US over to Europe. Okay, let's click to stop that preview and make sure we're back at the start of the timeline. What I'll do is I'll close that option up, hold down the space bar and just scroll through to the top of the window. And what we'll see here is I have another solid layer. This one's called Block Dissolve. Now I'm going to use this to show you just a couple of different transition effects that we have the option to choose in After Effects. So let's go ahead and turn the visibility of that layer on. And if I just come down here to switches and modes, we can see that we've got no effects applied to it as yet. We're ready to work with it. Now the reason we can't see it on screen is because this layer in fact doesn't start until we get to 4 seconds through the animation, and there's a reason for that. If we come through here, we've got our nice rotating radial wipes, and then once we reach this point, I'm going to bring in this solid blue background. Now that's going to finish up the animation because this is where our little smiley face starts to bounce over the top and finish off the sting for us. Now, this is going to be another transition effect. So right where this blue part appears, which is exactly at 4 seconds along, we're going to apply just a couple of different transition filters to try them out. Now the first one I'm going to do, if I go to my effects menu, straight back down to transition, we have Venetian blinds. Now this is a very straightforward one. We're applying it to our blue layer, so any changes we make we'll see directly through to the one beneath it. And if I take my transition completion value again and just click and drag, you'll see that we're able to apply kind of a blind setting where each of these objects forms into a strip that can then be used to reveal the layer behind. Now, once you've chosen a completion value, likewise to the other effects, you can choose the angle at which they go, which is pretty cool. We can also choose the width. That's pretty important. That's choosing the size of the blinds themselves. So as I increase outwards there, you see we bring down the number of blinds by making the actual pixel size even larger. Once you go back to transition completion, obviously you can fade in and out. And this in itself is a really nice effect. Another thing to point out there is obviously the feather value, so you can soften up those edges and then use that all together. Now, Venetian blinds are cool, but if you're looking for a really different 3D approach to the Venetian blinds, I would probably point you towards the card wipe and the card dance filters, which Brian is going to be using later on. Those are really, really powerful. Not only do you have control over things like this, but you can also have lighting on them, so it looks like the blinds are actually moving up and getting caught with a light source, and even sort of shuffle them gently so it looks like someone's moving the blinds as they're opening. This is a very basic filter. I did want to highlight it to you because it's good for certain things, but if you want something a little bit more dynamic, I recommend watching those effects demos with Brian later on. Okay, now I'm not going to use this one. I'm just going to hit delete to remove it from my effect controls palette. And I'm going to go back to the effect menu, back down to transition, and this time apply block dissolve, the first one in the list. Again, when that comes up, we don't see anything actually changing because don't forget it's going to reveal the layer we're working with. So if we take the transition completion value here and click and drag, you'll see basically a mass of pixels. They almost look like particles breaking apart to reveal the layer beneath. So even used in its most basic form, this is a really nice transition. Okay, it's very noisy, it's very sort of moving and very pixelated. But we're going to be able to adjust that to suit the requirements for this particular thing. This is a very digital looking animation, so we want it to look very computer generated. At the moment, I do have the soft edges best quality option turned on. That is the default. If I go ahead and turn that off, you'll see that we've lost the soft edges and we now have much sharper and harder pixels. It's very much like the noise filter we were looking at earlier on, but it's being used as a transition. Now, the important settings are obviously here, the block width and the block height, the same as we had a second ago with the Venetian blinds, where if we drag one of these up, you'll see that we're able to extend the width of this noise or these blocks that are being created. And likewise, let's change the block height to around about 17. And now we've got a computer generated effect. It looks like pixels are being revealed on screen to show exactly what's going on. Now again, the transition completion value will allow us to see more or less of this. And it looks really cool because you just delete all of these pixels. And we're obviously going to animate this in reverse because I don't want it visible to start with. So let's go all the way up to 100%. Transition is already complete and this is at 4 seconds. Don't forget that. Let's turn on a keyframe for transition completion. And then let's just move our timeline along to, let's go for 5 seconds. Let's make it a whole second long. So we've gone from 4 to 5. And all I'll simply do is now drag that value all the way back down to 0. Okay, so if we just scrub through the timeline, we're at 4 seconds. You'll see the effect is building up, replacing everything behind, and then our logo appears on top here. Now, just going back to the area that's transitioning, let's go about 4.5 seconds. A couple of other things to point out. You could obviously animate the width and the height over time. So if you wanted those to change, it's quite easy to do. I'm going to make this a little bit more blocky. I'm going to go for about 25 by 25, so we get much larger pixels. But then you can choose to feather as well. Now what I'll do is I'll drop down the slider for this so we can see that. And you can soften this up almost as if it's out of focus. And that's, again, something very, very different. If you want to just soften the edge, make it look like this screen is a little bit more out of focus and then this appears a bit easier over the top, that is something you can do. Just going back through there looks very, very different. So there's a bunch of things you can do with block dissolve. I am going to go back to its most basic function because I do want it, like I said, to be very pixel based. So that effect has been applied. Let's close this palette down and let's just hit the 0 key and do a final RAM preview of everything. So here we have our 2 radial wipes. They're all still in memory. Now we have our block dissolve appearing on top. And once that comes in, we're left with a static image and our graphic over the top. One final thing I should turn on. Let's just do a quick preview of this. There we go. There's our radar sweep. And then our transition to this final effect. Because there's so much motion going on here at the end of the animation, let's come over and turn on the overall motion blur for our layer. And I've actually got motion blur applied to our little laugh graphic here. So let's go back and do another RAM preview, and now we can see the overall thing. So again, the radial wipes. Once we get through to the end, there's our dissolve, and our character's got some motion to it. So it finishes off this title sequence really nicely. So the thing to point out here is that the transition filters that we've covered needn't be used just for very simple transitions, okay? You can use them for masks and traveling mats. You can use them for effects that can be seen through a certain layer. You can even apply them as adjustment layers. So there's many things you can do. Now what we'll do is take another look at a couple of other transition filters. We're going to produce some really cool effects. So let's go ahead and close this project down. Let's go to the project window and open our final composition, number 5, which is called Iris. Not to be confused with the lady's name. This is for an effect. So here we have our window, and if I just scroll through it, you'll see that we have an animation of our central graphics here, rotating around and then coming to a stop and then zooming up out. So we're going to use a couple of transition effects to make this all happen and see what's revealed underneath. Definitely going for a very English, almost Austin Powers feel for this type of animation, so let's see what we can do. The filter we're going to use to expose our background image through here is called Iris, and it produces a really nice mask effect where it just draws an object in the center which is either circular or star-shaped, perfect for exactly what I need. So what I'll do is down in the timeline, I'm going to select the psychedelic AI layer. This is an Illustrator graphic that's been brought in, so it's nice sharp vectors and can easily be scaled up and down. Again, I'm going to go to my effects menu, go straight down to transition, and this time we will choose Iris Wipe. Let's bring up the palette here so we can see its options. So like most of the others, we have the ability to adjust its central point so we can choose exactly where the effect takes place from. I'm not going to worry about that right now. What I'm concerned about are all the other options itself. So first off, we have what's called the outer radius. Now that's effectively the size of the transition. So you see as I drag this, I'm revealing the image beneath. This is our reveal value. This is kind of like the transition completion value we've seen already. And if I drag out here, we can see we've got some footage behind here. Got me composited onto a background of Buckingham Palace. And let's pull this back in here. The outer radius is in direct relation to the inner radius. There are two settings here, but if I drag the inner radius, I'm not going to get any results right now because I don't have this option turned on, use inner radius. When I turn that on, it's going to allow me to now produce a star type effect because I have the ability to control both radius values to give me different size and different effect stars. Now when we're dealing with stars, obviously you have a choice of all the points you wish around the outside, and that's just done here using the iris points option. So at the moment it's 6, which effectively gives you a 3-sided object because the points also count these middle ones. And I'm just going to go ahead and drag up here and choose however many I want. So not too many, maybe 14, 15 or 16, something like that. Pick whatever you're happy with. But then the inner radius can then be adjusted to make the star slightly bigger to expose a little bit more area, or obviously pull it down and make it a lot finer. If you wanted to, you could even just pull that all the way down and have that act as the transition. So it almost looks like something opening rather than a star growing. Okay, so I'm fairly happy with that. Roundabout, let's choose something like this. Let's go for about 74, 75, and I'll just round that down to about 350. Okay, now the outer radius is what's going to animate. This is the important thing because as we saw already, the outer radius is what reveals the layer underneath. But this presents us with a small problem. The inner radius at the moment has been set, and if I took the outer radius and keyframed it in order to animate it, we're going to have an interesting effect. We're going to actually turn the shape inside out and come all the way down here, and this is not what I want. I actually want the outer radius to grow, and I want the inner radius to grow in accordance with it, so it keeps a constant scale, so we end up with a permanently sized star that grows and shrinks on both radius values at the same time. How do we do that? We're going to use an expression for that because it's going to allow me to easily link together two layers and just say copy, okay? So what I'll do to make this easy, make sure we're back at the start of the timeline, you're at 0 seconds, and I'm going to just keep the outer radius, it doesn't matter where it is at the moment, let's go for about 300, just keep it even. And then what I'll do is I'll apply a keyframe for the outer radius, again don't forget we're at 0 seconds, and the same for the inner radius. Now I'm only going to animate the outer radius, but the reason I apply an inner radius keyframe is so I can find it easily down in my timeline. So let's go down to the timeline and hit the U key just to select all of the items that have keyframes on them. You see here is my outer and inner radius. And I've just activated them very simply and easily because now I can turn off the inner radius one. So don't want any keyframe on there, but again, just so I could select it. That's why I added a keyframe in the first place. Now what I'm going to do is hold down the Alt key or the Option key on the Mac and apply an expression. So just by simply clicking on the stopwatch, we apply an expression. And what I want it to do is to say, I want to copy the value that I have for the outer radius, but keep a constant proportion of about 1/3 of the size. Now, if you know JavaScript, that's fairly easy to do. I'm going to make it very straightforward because Brian's going to do some really cool things with expressions later on, so I'm not going to go into depth now. What I'm going to do is come down here and choose this tool. This is the Pick Whip tool. And what it does allows me to go and point it to a value that I wish to copy. So I'm actually dragging it and saying, please copy the outer radius. So I'm taking the inner radius value and saying copy the outer radius, and you see it's placed in the script for me. So it tells me it's using the effect Iris White is taking its outer radius parameter, and effectively that's going to copy it. And if I did say OK at this point, I'm going to end up back with a circle because the inner and outer radius would be exactly the same. What I'm going to do is just edit the script slightly. I'm just going to put a space in there and add what I want to do. All I'm going to say is divide it by 3. So I'm just going to use / and hit 3. And that's going to say for every value you have on the outer radius, give me a third of that size. If I just hit enter to say OK, you'll see that my size here on screen has now changed slightly. You can see that it's slightly moved itself around. If we come up here to the outer radius and just drag it, you'll see that the inner radius is now connected to it permanently. I don't see a shift in proportions. They're perfectly staying a third of the way apart. And that's the really easy way to control the inner and outer radius of the iris wipe so you can keep it consistent. So all we need to do now is apply the keyframe in the right place to make this object grow over the time of our animation. Okay, so let's come back down to the timeline. And what we'll do is just move across to 1 second. Now this is where our animation starts to play of the object moving around the screen. See, that's where it just starts to do its thing. So what I'll do is I'll take this keyframe we've already created and move it along with the shift key so it snaps here onto my timeline. And then I'm just going to take our value right here and take that all the way back down to 0 because we're not going to have any transition at that point. Now we can take the time cursor across to 2 seconds where the rotation animation ends. And let's take that value and drag it as high as we need to in order to get this off screen. So just keep on going until you're happy with the finished result, which is way up there. We've got over 1200. Okay, and we now reveal everything. So just a quick drag through there and we can see the iris effect doing exactly what we want it to do. Now the final thing I want to do to this is rotate the angle of the star based on the rotation of the shape in the center as well. So it's very much more dynamic. So again, we can do that through a very simple expression. So let's come back over here to the timeline. And what I'll do is I need to activate the rotation value here in my effect. So for that, I'm just going to click to collapse it, click to open it again. And here I can see just a bit further down, we have our rotation value. Now I'm going to tie that together with an expression to the rotation of the top layer. So I'm not going to bother with keyframes. What we do need to do is just scroll again all the way to the top. Here's our heart logo. I'm just going to select that and hit the R key to expose its rotation keyframes. And we can see those in the timeline. This is the value I'm going to copy with an expression. So same as we did before, let's just come all the way down. Here's our rotation value for our background iris wipe. I'm just going to hold down the Alt key or the Option key on the Mac and click on the stopwatch for rotation, and that will apply our expression. And again, I'm just going to point and shoot. I'm going to pick the pick whip tool up, and let's go all the way up the list here, straight to the rotation value for our heart logo, okay? Now, it's been applied. There's our JavaScript. If I just hit Enter at this point to say OK, I'm just going to scrub through the timeline, and you'll see that they are perfectly matched together, okay? We're getting exactly the same amount of motion, and the ease keyframe is also being respected, but at the same time, the star is moving about twice the speed I want it to. So just like we did with the script above it, I'm going to click back in this one, just go to the end of it, and I'm going to say divide by 2, okay? So /2 is going to take the rotation value of the heart layer, but divide it by 2 to give us the rotation value of the iris wipe. Again, let's say OK. And now when we go through, you'll see that the central graphic is rotating twice the speed of the outer one, so it's not so crazy and manic. So let me just close down the effect controls window here, and let's just hit the 0 key, do a quick RAM preview of this. There we go. That's come up really quick because we've obviously been scrubbing through the timeline. So there's our zoom effect. We get our logo, and then it zooms up over the top, and we've got the key footage of me on the background here. And this is really cool. What we're going to do now is close this up by doing a couple of other effects, one of which is another transition, the last one we're going to use, which is called gradient wipe. Now, very, very different to what you might expect it to be. I'm just going to come to where we can see me on the timeline. I'm around about 4 seconds, somewhere around there. And back down in the timeline, what I'm going to do is just scroll down, tidy this all up. So let's close up the psychedelic layer, close up the heart one. And what we'll do is select this one right here, Steve Movie. Now, the reason I'm going to show you gradient wipe is it's a great way to actually make objects fade in unevenly. So instead of just doing a regular transition, gradient wipe is going to make it more sort of ghostly as if we're appearing through fog. Now for that reason, I've created a layer here that is called fog. And what I do is just turn it on and solo it so you can see it. It's just a bunch of gray pixels that have been generated inside of Photoshop. So it's just a PSD file I've placed in. Now what I'm going to do is turn off the solo and turn off the layer. I don't actually need to see it for the gradient wipe to work. All I need to ensure is that the layer itself is in the file. That's all I need to make sure of. So Steve Movie is still selected. What I'm going to do is go back to my effects menu, go again straight down to transition, and go straight across to gradient wipe. Okay. Now, a lot of people think that this filter is used in a similar way to the linear wipe with a soft edge, and I must admit that's what I used to think, but it's much more powerful than that. If I just pull this up over here, let's close up. I do already have an effect on this keyed layer, so we have a way of just gently removing some of the blue pixels from around the outside. But the gradient wipe here works on taking the luminance values from another layer and using them for transparency on the one that we have. So at the moment, even if I go transition complete, I don't see a thing, okay, until the very end, and obviously it's 100, but the difference between 99 and 100 is all or nothing, okay? So that's not what we're going to do. Let me undo that. The gradient layer here is what is important. What it allows me to do is choose any other layer inside my composition. It could even be the movie of me myself, but I'm going to go down and choose fog. What that will do is use the grayscale levels of the fog layer to mask out certain parts of this image unevenly, okay? So just take the transition completion, click and drag, and you'll see as I do, we get this wonderful fade out, very irregular, of the character in the foreground, okay? It's beautiful fade out that's done totally unevenly based on the gray pixels and the white and the black, obviously, which give you 100% opacity and 100% transparency. Now, done like this, it's fairly straightforward. So what we do have is the ability to apply softness. And as we do that, we can then feather the edges in together, which looks really cool. And then just go through that transition value again, and this can blend in from nothing, which would obviously be 100%, and then fade back in towards 0. So let's have a quick look at keyframing that. Let's come back down to the timeline, and let's scroll to where we're first going to see me appear. Okay, so here is our transition all moving from the background. So I'm going to say round about 2 seconds is where you first want to see me start appearing. Okay, so we don't want me visible at this point. So come back to the Effect Controls palette, take the transition completion value here, and take that all the way up to 100%. So from the beginning of the animation to here, which is 2 seconds along, it will be 100%, which is completely invisible. Let's turn on a keyframe for that. Again, we're at 2 seconds. And then the timeline, let's just scroll through to maybe a second, just over a second. I'm going to go for about 310, something like that. Choose wherever you want. Then come back to the effect controls here and take the transition all the way back to 0. And then I will fade in over the background. Okay, let me close that one down. Let's do a RAM preview of this. So there's our original iris wipe. There's no character in there. And now what happens is the moving graphics now fade in with this wonderful gradient backdrop. Almost makes it look very ghostly, as if we've got a character just gently blending through from the background. Now don't forget, we're using a static background there. You could use a QuickTime movie for that has been rendered and can have different levels of grayscale in there that actually move. So it's a great way to composite figures into a cloudy background or underwater and make things interact with their background a little bit more. Okay, there's one final thing I want to add to this composition. It's another filter that I haven't touched on yet, just to add one final effect, and it's called brush strokes. So what I'm going to do is come all the way back to the very beginning of the animation, and I'm going to apply it to a composition we've already been working on. So up here in the project window, we have our Emboss Find Edges project. That's the one we worked on for our planet travel. And I'm going to take that whole composition and drag it into the top of my timeline so it appears on top of everything else. There we go. And what I'll do is I'll just solo it, then we don't have to worry about rendering the other files for a second. Now what I'm going to do is go to my Effect menu, come down here to Stylize, and then choose Brush Strokes. And what we'll get immediately is this sort of mass of painted strokes that we can see. If I just do a 0 RAM preview of this, you'll see that each of the strokes are animated. Okay, it's just building this up slowly. If I do a click just to play back in real time, you'll see that there's a lot of motion going on with these brush strokes. In itself, it's a great filter if that is the effect that you're looking for. Okay, we can still see the sun moving around in the background and everything else. The reason I'm using this effect is I'm going to make an outdoor sign from it, the sort of sign that you would see at a ball game or something with all the thousands and thousands of tiny lights that kind of distort the image a bit and show it in a very, very large format on a big screen. And we're going to achieve that effect actually using brush strokes. So I'm not going to use all of the settings that we have here. I'm just going to fine tune a lot of them. But just so you know what a lot of the features are, we have obviously the brush size itself. So as you increase the size of the brush, it increases the dimensions of the strokes that actually apply the paint. Again, the stroke length will obviously lengthen out the amount of time that those strokes play for. The more that you apply that, obviously the more it distorts the image. So we're going to work a lot finer than that. But you can see all of these things. Kind of looks like a crowd, in fact, already at this point. You can use brush strokes for that. As long as you have an image that's got plenty of contrast in it, you could create a moving crowd in a distance very easily. So we have the stroke density and the stroke randomness as well. The randomness is obviously what controls the speed that we see. Okay, so if I pull this all the way down to 0 and do a preview, we don't have any motion, okay? The only motion we have are the original pixels moving in the background layer. So this is very much based on how we're going to do the effect ourselves. Now what I will do is tell it on the paint surface I want to paint it instead of onto the original image, which will leave an alpha channel behind. I'm just going to come down and say paint on black. So it puts a black background behind this image, so wherever we see any holes, we will actually see through to black. And then what I'll do is come through and adjust some of these settings. So at the moment, the stroke angle, as you can see, is going from sort of top left to bottom right. That's 135 degrees. I'm just going to pull this down to 180, so all the strokes come down. Then what we'll do is we'll set the brush size. It's a little too large at this point, so I'm just going to bring this down to maybe 2.5 or 3. That's pretty good. You can actually see now these little dots appearing inside the background, so it's giving us that kind of cracked up, broken light background. And then the stroke length obviously is fairly important. At the moment that's set to 15, which is why it's offset so much from the top of the screen. So let's bring this all the way back, and as I do, let's maybe take it to just about 1. And now you can see exactly the effect we're looking for. We've got these lovely little dots that show up. It's almost like mosaic, but a little bit more controlled because we have each individual object containing its own separate amount of color. It's just looking really, really cool. Now the stroke density is what's important. That actually increases the gaps between each of these dots and then allows us to see which direction we're going. So as I drag the density down, it's going to open up the spacing and show us less detail. Okay, so 0.3 is not too bad, but it's a little too broken up. So I'm going to bring it, let's go for about 0.5 for now. And we can always adjust this afterwards, so don't worry about that. Again, let's just do a quick round preview of that. And now almost looks like the Vegas feel. We have all the tiny sequins all on the side of a board and they're just gently rustling in the wind. Perfect way to do it. It's almost looking exactly the same way. So there's a bunch of effects you can do with this one filter. What I'm going to do is just apply a very small amount of randomness or animation to it. So let's go really small, about 0.2. And then let's just say preview. And you'll see that that has now got the motion that I'm looking for. We've got these wonderful color pixels where the plane is in the center and the sun moving around the outside. Gives us a completely different feel. So this is a cool way if you wanted to create just a backdrop effect using brush strokes for kind of a board game. But there's one thing I want to add to this. Now, if you have the production bundle, you will be able to follow through with this part of the lesson. If you have the standard bundle, you may as well just watch it and see exactly what I'm going to do, but you won't be able to use the filter I'm going to use, which is called corner pin. That's going to allow me to distort this to fit it onto our image in the background. If I come back down to the timeline, I'm just going to turn off the solo option so we could see all the layers beneath. And if I just turn off the top layer for a second, and let's come down and turn off the psychedelic one as well, you can see that I have this black board here that I've gloriously erected in front of the Buckingham Palace. We're going to throw our graphics onto there using corner pins. This is the whole outdoor sign effect that I'm doing. So psychedelic I can leave off for now. What I'm going to do is turn back on our emboss find edges layer. Then I'm going to come up to my effect menu. Let's come down and choose distort. And over here I have corner pin. Again, let me just remind you this is a production bundle filter only. So make sure you have the pro bundle if you're going to follow this along. So I'm going to choose corner pin. It's going to get added on top of my brush strokes filter so it can all be added together. And you see I have a choice of moving the upper left, upper right, lower left, and lower right points into the position I want them to be. Well, I can actually do that manually, all right? So what I'm going to do is just pull that palette out of the way, come here into the main comp, and just pick these points up and move them. And you see I'm able to distort this into any direction I want. What I'll do is quickly pull them down into roughly the position needed. Then I can fine-tune it. So let's get it into that area. I'll just change my zoom up to 100%. Let's go full quality. I'll just use the spacebar to scroll myself over here, and then I can just fine-tune this into exactly the location on the corners of my billboard outside the Queen's residence, which I'm sure she will love to see when she steps out the front door next time. Let's pull this down here. Wonderful. Okay, let me do a round preview of that just to check, and you can see that all the pixels are moving. We've still got everything working together, but we've used this brushstrokes filter to create a wonderful electronic outdoor sign effect. And it's just looking really cool. It's like there's a full digital screen here that's doing all our work. So what we'll do, let's just come back down to 50%, again, half quality. There we go, everything's in place. Come back down to my timeline. Let's turn on the psychedelic layer. Okay, so the background's still there. And let's take this whole corner pin effect we've done and drag it down. Let's put it below me just to be on the safe side in case my arm just moves across the edge of it. We don't want it to be in the wrong layer order. And what I'll do just for good measure is I'll go ahead and turn on the motion blur because we do have motion blur on the heart logo as it spins around the center. Let's come back to the composition. Let's hit the 0 key, do a final round preview. And now we can see all the effects in place. So there's our iris wipe here that was using the star effect. And those star radius values will link together using an expression to make sure they always stay proportionate. We also added an expression to the rotation value to match the rotation of the shape in the center that spins around like so. We then took the keyed footage in the background and we used the gradient white filter to make that fade in, which looks really cool. Some wonderful things you can do with that. And then finally, we used the brush strokes filter to just create our sign background, and obviously used corner pin to pull that all into place. So you can see here the transition filters are extremely powerful. Just where you use them and how you use them together with other filters is how you make them look so much more intense.